What we thought we would do would be to begin, each speaker has a brief observation about how to make Europe more competitive, to accelerate it. And I know, Keegan, are you starting?
Yeah, happy to. So I was asked to talk a little bit about sort of European technological competitiveness. And as a starting point, I think I'll just kind of make 3 points before handing it off to the other co-panelists here. So the first point is Europe finds itself in perhaps one of the most tense and dangerous geopolitical situations it's been in for quite some time. You have obviously a war going on in Ukraine. You have sort of growth in Euroscepticism across the continent. There's rearming and everything else going on. So that's the first point. Geopolitically, it's a very interesting time. The second point is that for Europe to be strong and to be able to navigate this sort of turbulent time, it has to be more competitive when it comes to technology. And then the third point is this is actually not something new. You can go back into the 1990s, into the 1980s, look at things like the Bingaman Report, and what they will say is, we're falling behind, and we're falling behind because we're not taking technology serious enough. And what's kind of disappointing about this is if you look at a lot of the American tech companies, you'll find American talent. If you look at the most innovative countries in the world, many of them are in Europe. If you look at the most competitive tax regimes, many of them are in Europe. If you look at the amount of money that is in Europe, actually Europeans save more than Americans. But the problem is there's this sort of regulatory environment that is really, really hamstringing and holding Europe back. The Draghi report laid out more than 400, or around 400 recommendations, and I think less than 11% have been implemented. He says in that report that Europe actually is doing okay when it comes to productivity if you strip the technology out. And I think that's the main message that I have is you can't strip the technology out. This is real, it's happening, and if Europe doesn't get serious about it, it's going to find itself falling further and further behind those who do.
Marta?
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Following up on what Keegan said, I have some similar points, but more from a perspective of the International Crisis Group, a non-conflict prevention, conflict resolution organization working with 50 conflicts around the world, and we monitor very much conflict trends and how geopolitical trends also affect these questions of war and peace. And obviously what we are observing very much along the lines of what you've just mentioned is that we're operating very much in a very different world from the world that Europe and specifically the EU was built for. So the EU was built for peaceful times, and it really needs to navigate this transition into a new world operating under very different rules. What we've observed is that the global order is shifting away from rules, multilateralism, restraint, towards geopolitical competition, the world being carved out into spheres of influence, less regard for international law, for rules, and with much more aggressive use of power. Conflicts are much more frequent, more brutal, and less constrained by international accountability, as I just said. So war crimes often go unpunished. And with that, peacemaking is changing too. There's less focus on comprehensive peace agreements and much more pressure on quick transactional, some call it dirty deals as well. So we see clearly that observing, for example, debates on Ukraine and Gaza, where there's much more of a focus on a ceasefire as opposed to carefully negotiated peace agreements, which very much sort of defined how peace was being made in the 90s. So why is that important for competitiveness? I think it's very important because Europe is based on this model of we based our model on a relative stable and secure environment. And we've somehow outsourced our security and our hard power to the United States and to NATO. And so because we were outsourcing our hard power and our security and defense to NATO and the United States, we were able to focus on things like rules, trade power, regulatory influence, and building a single market. And so we were very much able to leverage that economic power that somehow worked because our existence was not at stake. It's not that, and the war in Ukraine really sort of challenged the basic foundations of that model in a way. Not just the war in Ukraine, but also the geopolitical shifts around the war in Ukraine. So how do you navigate that transition? I think that for me is the biggest dilemma, the biggest challenge that Europe and the EU is faced with in this moment, along the lines of what you just said. But I would also argue that one of the biggest challenges is this tension. I mean, there are many different challenges, but I will just finish with, I think, what I think is the biggest dilemma is really how you become competitive without, how do you project, how do you promote economic competitiveness without the hard power to back it, on the one hand, and this is what Europe is now working to change, but also how do you do that without upholding democratic values, right? In a world where power seems to matter more and norms matter less, and the EU, as we know it, is an organization based on norms and rules and speaks that language and has to learn to speak the language of power. And so how do you do that in a world and with great, global powers that seem to disregard rules and international law that, are there to also restrain how power functions and works. And so Europe cannot be the only one preaching democracy while others disregard it. And so I think navigating this equation and this balance in a way that helps Europe on the global stage is critical, and that goes for competitiveness, but competitiveness has many different facets. It's not just economic.
Thank you. So, Keri, perhaps you might add your thoughts on Europe establishing itself or re-establishing itself with all this new technology. I know your focus is on AI.
Yes. So I think echoing some of what Marta's gone after is you've got this fundamental base of democratic values and things that the EU finds important and that must be built into technology, all of which I'm not in disagreement with. But I think what this provides to companies or potential companies is not where to run to, it's what you're running from. It's saying, here's what we want you not to do, but it doesn't provide a basis of where to go. That's very difficult in trying to establish how can we build, how can we innovate. So when the EU established the EU AI Act, it ultimately dropped the draft AI liability directive, which meant that companies were left with all the things they shouldn't do, but not the ways in which they shouldn't do them. And that seems like a very fine line, but it's saying, don't do these, you will be liable, but we're not going to tell you how. And that gives very little certainty in trying to build. Additionally, you've got a variety of different regulatory instruments built in different ways, in different fashions, that will govern sector by sector, but that don't give any assurity in, let's say, the AI space.
So can there be, I mean, maybe one of you want to take this, is there such a thing as a European model as an alternative to either the US or the Chinese model? Is that what you're saying? Or are you suggesting that Europe is still searching for a model in this new world?
So, maybe just to kick this off, I think at the moment, there's been a massive shift in how we're thinking about technology, sovereignty, power, and a lot of it is being driven by advancements in AI. And the truth of the matter is, at the moment, if you're not the US or China, let's say you're in South America, you're in Africa, Southeast Asia, you're going to be forced to choose a side. Are you going to sort of adopt the China tech stack, including its sort of 5G infrastructure, smart city infrastructure, and so on? Or are you going to go with the US, move more into its cloud? Europe really doesn't have something that can compete with this if you have to choose. And so I think the question that Europe has to ask itself is, what does it take to get the rest of the world to choose Europe? And the truth is, you have to have a strong, vibrant, and robust technology industry. And we know what needs to be done to fix that, but politically, it's incredibly hard. There needs to be things happening at the EU level. There needs to be things happening at the member state level, covering labor market reform, pension reform, savings accounts. Capital isn't being used efficiently. It's hard to build and scale. We know all of this, but until that's fixed, you're going to continue to see the exodus of talent to the United States and to other countries. You're going to see the money that's funding European startups coming from the United States. And this is only going to expedite the more and more and more influential that AI becomes. Yeah.
I think I can comment a jurisdiction that's trying to walk the tightrope between, let's say, the EU and the US approach, and that would be the UK, who are trying to, I think, invest in both, talent and industry and pouring a bunch of money into the area, while trying to appeal by being less regulation than the EU, but possibly slightly more structured than the US. Whether they successfully navigate that tightrope will be very interesting to watch.
Is there a kind of historical paradox here, or an entertaining paradox for the rest of the world, that the Europeans have always managed the world historically? Now they're just another piece of it. You mentioned Africa and Asia. Europe doesn't seem to be any more powerful or significant. Why should Europeans believe that they even have a place at the table now dominated by the Chinese and the United States?
If you look at the sort of statistical indicators in Europe compared to the United States, compared to China, great education systems, great quality of life, longer lifespans, better healthcare systems. Life quality is actually okay. So the question is, why do we actually need the technology if everything is going fine? And I think the message is that with artificial intelligence, this has changed. And so if it was fine when it came to cloud computing or other forms of sort of technological innovation, you have the President of the United States signing an executive order saying we're going to automate scientific discovery. You have trillions of dollars being poured into AI infrastructure. So yes, it might be okay now, but if you don't make the investments and you don't build out the infrastructure now, it's going to be a very different story in the short, medium, and long term. So I think the situation has changed, but politically it's very hard to get voters to care about this because they don't feel the sort of broader geopolitical importance all the time.
I mean, is there a scenario where Europe, it seems to me, I live in the US, I was born in Europe, Europe has simply become a museum for culture and human rights, and that's a viable model for the 21st century, and why shouldn't Europeans be satisfied with that?
I think I can take that one. I think it's a case of write your future or someone writes it for you. So I think as a born and raised Canadian, it's fair to say we're defined often more by what we aren't than what we are. We aren't American, we aren't European. But let's say if Europe, the EU, the UK are content to let American and Chinese companies write the technological future, social systems change drastically, and you see that in very small and interesting ways leaking into important parts of life. And if you'll forgive the legal background, we're seeing it in the courts. Let's say self-represented litigants are using LLMs to come up with cases to defend their points, cases that either have never existed or are American or represent American points of law. This is creeping into multitudes of the ways in which we interact, we exist, and some of the larger structures like the judicial system. If you don't build your own, someone builds it for you.
Yeah, I mean, translating into more of the issues that I cover, which are more questions of war and peace and how Europe is responding, for example, to the war in Ukraine and to wars in its vicinity and to the state of global disorder in a way, is, of course, a big debate on Europe's strategic autonomy. So why should Europe want to become strategically autonomous and more self-reliant? Because precisely what we've seen over the past couple of years, specifically following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is how, strategic dependencies and, can be so easily exploited by and subject of coercion by powers like the United States, China, Russia, and even now the United States.
That was a slip, wasn't it?
Yes, and now also, Europe had always trusted in its long-standing ally, and now it has to learn how, that its long-standing ally is not treating it anymore as an ally. And so and not only is it not only always treating it as an ally, it is also inscribing it in its national security strategy, in its foreign policy, the fragmentation of Europe, the end of the EU as we know it.
So are you suggesting, Marta, that you mentioned innovation and power, and Europe has to wake up to recognize that power is the new dominant currency of this second quarter of the 21st century? Is the main challenge for Europe not so much technological innovation, but power, military power. Will the technology come if it rearms? I mean, we're talking in Germany. People, maybe it's impolite to talk in Germany about German rearmament, but this is the center of the continent.
Yes, I mean, those two elements are very much intertwined, right? Like technological development as well as military power go hand in hand, and one feeds off the other. And so one of the critical debates in Europe is how to become more, how to invest in its defense capacity, in its capabilities, how to depend less on others, on the US for its own security, which is still very critically dependent on. And how to navigate this transition over, in a time frame that is manageable, because it cannot do that overnight, and it still needs to, and this is the biggest challenge with the U.S. because it has still to maintain this relationship with the United States.
I mean, you say that it's a phrase you often hear in Europe. You cannot do it overnight. But in America, you do things overnight. Sometimes they're good things, sometimes not such good things.
America is one country, and Europe and the EU is 27 member states, and we've spoken about this. I mean, you've alluded to that as well. So it's a very different reality, and I think one of the biggest challenges, as you've mentioned as well, it's 27 different.
Could it or should it at least trigger a conversation about breaking up the EU if indeed this model, this federated model, doesn't work, if for Europe to keep up with the US and China? Should we re-examine the EU?
I'll just throw it in. It's going to be controversial, but that's fine. But I would say if Europe doesn't take technology seriously, that's the most likely outcome. Europe will find itself in a world where other countries dominate the entire tech stack. And just to be clear, Europe does have a lot of capacity in things like advanced manufacturing, robotics, so it's not to discount that. But this is a fundamental component of power and influence as it continues to develop and as the world order sort of responds. It will be very hard for the EU to continue to exist in its current format, I would expect, without sort of significant change in the long run. In the medium term, short term, I think it's fine, but long term, the structure is going to be quite hard.
Is there an argument to make that it's already too late? I've been coming to DLD now for 15 years. Every year that we have the same conversation about why Europe is behind the US, less about China. Now China is part of the conversation. And every year there are panels, Europe needs to catch up, needs to do this and that, and it never does. So at what point does it become too late?
I'm not sure I would agree that it never does. I mean, from the lens through which I observe the world, at least, or through the response to Ukraine, I think very much it was.
But we're talking about technological innovation.
Yes, yes, okay. But I think just going back to the point on disintegrating the EU, I mean, the question we ought to ask ourselves is also, will Europe be stronger if it's disintegrated? Does that make a difference? I mean, it's still, it's not 27, but more, because including non-EU countries, still various 30-something national administrations operating under different rules. So is that the better option?
Keri, you're an expert on AI. Is AI Europe's last stand, last opportunity to get its act together?
Well, to the previous question, I'll briefly say, I mean, surely not far enough. Surely we should be, only nations of technology. You can have the United Regions of Google, the Republic of Amazon. Which one of these should Europe aspire to be? To the second question, is AI the last stand? I don't think there ever is a last stand. But I will say that because we tend to treat AI as a monolith, I think we lose some of the possible potential and wins with it. So much when we talk about AI, we talk about large language models and digital only. But some of the biggest and best things we can do, I think, are that which interacts with the physical world. And that, I think, the EU possibly has its own best use cases to follow. I think limiting itself to the ways in which companies are currently making headlines means we disregard what tomorrow's biggest possibilities might be.
Just because I think this is a really important point. Europe has, if you think about the sort of trajectory of AI, the US is absolutely dominating on the digital front. You know, you go to ChatGPT, you ask your questions, get an answer. But if you start thinking about the future, more sort of embedded AI, the use of autonomous vehicles, robotics, that's actually where Europe has significant capability. And so the combination of AI, as it starts to get embedded, there's like a real opportunity here in Europe. And the flip side of this is also that because Europe is behind the United States in terms of its markets and tech industry, there's also massive potential for growth. So we are starting to see, you know, finance become increasingly interested. But until some of the regulations around that are more, let's say, pro-innovation, that will still be a little bit sketchy. And at the end of the day, the European Union and sort of Europe at large needs to start acting more like a digital superpower or a hegemon, but that goes against the structure that the EU was created within. So you have this tension between what Europe must do if it wants to remain relevant and grow influential and powerful versus its founding principles, and they're sometimes a bit antagonistic.
You spent a lot of time on the Ukraine. Has the war really triggered an existential crisis for Europe, in your view?
Because the war didn't start in 2022. It started also already with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And it's about Russia's intentions beyond Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is very much not an issue of territory. It's not about territorial gains. It's about an idea, and it's about, you know, wanting to have influence over the neighborhood, over what it considers its past, its former sphere of influence. So if the world is organized under sphere of influences and following that logic, then obviously the EU, and I mean, Europe is very large, it includes Russia and Turkey as well, but if we speak about EU territory, you know, there is also, even recently, drone incursions, airspace violations, constant threats that Russia will not stop at Ukraine, it will go into Moldova, it could go into the Baltic states, into what it considers its former, its former sphere of influence. And so, obviously, for the EU as such, this is a source of threat, and there are many other examples of Russian aggressive behavior in the region. And but what a challenge that the EU is faced with is it's very much there's divergent even threat perceptions across the continent, and the further west and south you go, the less imminent and existential the threat faces, which goes back to the dilemma that we were talking about.
Your point on, so let's then, we began with each of you sort of setting out how you'd like to accelerate innovation in Europe in a broad sense. We've got 3 minutes left. Perhaps each of you might just focus for a minute on one thing that could help stimulate. There are no magic wands here, as we've noted. You can't transform Europe overnight. But where can we begin if as Europeans, you all want Europe to take back that place at the top table in the world? What needs to happen?
Sandboxes. I'm a big proponent of sandboxes because giving industry the place to try out new things and get it wrong is an immensely powerful way to get it right. So having a direct dialogue, giving a place for things to happen, giving a place to get a bit messy, and doing a lot of different ones in a lot of locations, I think would be incredibly powerful and also signal to industry that this is a place to innovate and how to do it.
So we've got sandboxes from Keri. Marta, what's your one idea?
I think for Europe to have a seat at the table, it needs to be able to project power. And in order to be able to project power, it needs to speak with a single voice.
And finally, Keegan.
There are countries within the EU that know what they're doing. They're incredibly innovative. You look at Sweden, look at Estonia, look at Poland. Get people together who are like-minded, start doing coalitions of the willing, and just get on with it. I think this is what it's going to ultimately come back to is, you know, adapt or die, and those who want to move should be able to.
Well, there you have it. 3 things: sandboxes, adapt or die, and power. Maybe you need a military. Thank you, all 3. Wonderful conversation about the key issue, which always seems to dominate DLD. Thank you so much.